You really think a man pushing a baggage cart belongs anywhere near my jet? The words floated across the private terminal with just enough volume to draw quiet laughter from the executives gathered beside the gleaming Gulfstream G700. For a brief moment, conversation stopped, polished shoes paused on the warm Texas concrete, and every eye drifted toward the man in the faded Navy maintenance shirt standing beside a weathered airport tug. Caleb Dawson looked up slowly, his expression calm, almost thoughtful, as if the remark had been carried away by the same late afternoon breeze that rolled across Dallas Executive Airport. He didn't answer. He simply tightened the strap, securing a row of luggage carts before checking the pressure gauge on the tug one more time. Years ago, that silence would have invited another challenge. Now it had become his greatest strength. Around him, the airport shimmered beneath the July sun. Heat danced above the runway, turbine engines hummed in the distance, and the sharp scent of jet fuel mixed with freshly cut grass beyond the perimeter fence. Every arriving aircraft carried someone important. Every departing one promised another fortune waiting to be made. Yet Caleb belonged to none of those worlds anymore. At least, that was what everyone believed. Lauren Hayes stepped down the aircraft stairs with effortless confidence. At 29, she had become one of the youngest aerospace CEOs in America, and the financial press rarely missed an opportunity to celebrate her ambition. Her tailored ivory suit caught the sunlight as if it had been made for moments exactly like this. Behind her followed attorneys, investors, assistants, and security personnel, all moving with the practiced rhythm of people who measured every minute in dollars. She glanced toward the maintenance crew only because one of the flight attendants had pointed in their direction. "Is everything ready?" she asked. "Almost, ma'am," the captain replied. "We just need one last inspection on the ground equipment." Lauren's eyes landed on Caleb for only a heartbeat before a faint smile curved across her face. "Good," she said lightly. "I'd rather have him polishing the landing gear than dreaming about flying my airplane." More laughter drifted through the group, polite and effortless, disappearing almost as quickly as it had appeared. Caleb simply nodded to another mechanic and continued working without lifting his eyes again. One young baggage handler frowned, confused by the older man's composure. "Doesn't that bother you?" he whispered. Caleb secured the final latch before answering in the same quiet voice he used with everyone. People usually speak from what they know. The young man waited for more, but nothing came. Across the tarmac, an 8-year-old girl sat on a nearby bench coloring airplanes in a sketchbook while swinging her sneakers above the pavement. Emma Dawson looked toward her father with complete confidence, smiling the way only children can when they believe someone is quietly capable of anything. She had heard strangers underestimate him before. She had also learned that her father never argued with anyone trying to measure him by his uniform. High above them, another jet crossed the brilliant blue Texas sky, leaving a long white trail stretching toward the horizon. Caleb watched it for only a second before returning to work. No one gathered on that private ramp recognized the subtle way his eyes followed the aircraft's climb, or the instinctive precision with which he judged its angle against the afternoon wind. No one noticed because no one was looking for a story hidden beneath grease-stained hands and worn work boots. But before the sun set over Dallas, the woman who had laughed beside her billion-dollar jet would place those same steady hands inside its cockpit, and everyone standing on that ramp would discover that dignity has a way of waiting patiently for the perfect altitude. The laughter faded with the sound of departing engines, but the words themselves lingered in the warm evening air far longer than anyone expected. Caleb Dawson never carried insults home. They were too heavy, and Emma deserved a father whose shoulders were free enough to carry hope instead. By 6:30 that evening, the airport was settling into its quieter rhythm. The last corporate departures rolled toward the runway, while maintenance crews replaced the daytime bustle with careful routines and patient hands. Caleb clocked out, collected his faded lunch cooler, and walked toward the small pickup truck parked beneath a row of weathered oak trees. Emma was already waiting with her backpack resting beside her feet and her sketchbook balanced on her knees. The moment she saw him, her face brightened. "Did you fix all the airplanes today, Daddy?" she asked with a smile that somehow erased the weight of every difficult day. Caleb laughed softly as he opened the passenger door for her. Only the parts that needed fixing. She climbed inside and held up her newest drawing. It showed a sleek business jets soaring above bright white clouds, while a little girl waved from the cockpit window. "Do you think I will fly one someday?" she asked. Caleb studied the picture for a moment before fastening her seatbelt. "If you work hard enough, you can fly anything your heart is willing to earn." Emma tilted her head. "Did you ever fly one?" Caleb started the truck before answering. "A long time ago." She waited, hoping for another story, but she already knew how these conversations usually ended. Her father rarely spoke about the years before she was born. He never complained, never blamed anyone, and never described himself as extraordinary. At home, his old photographs remained tucked inside a cedar box on the highest shelf of the hallway closet, far above Emma's reach. Their small house sat on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, where children still rode bicycles until sunset, and neighbors greeted each other from front porches. It was modest, clean, and filled with reminders that love could exist without luxury. The kitchen smelled of tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches as Caleb prepared dinner, while Emma completed her summer reading assignment at the table. The television remained off. Instead, soft jazz drifted from an old radio resting beside the refrigerator. It had been Sarah's favorite station years ago, and although she was gone, Caleb had never changed the preset. Emma looked up from her book. The lady at the airport looked important. Caleb placed another sandwich onto her plate. "She has a lot of responsibility. She laughed at you." The words came quietly, without anger, only curiosity. Caleb sat across from his daughter and folded his hands. "Sometimes people only see the uniform someone is wearing." Emma frowned. "That is not fair." "No," Caleb agreed gently. "But fairness and kindness are not always the same thing." She thought about that while dipping her sandwich into the warm soup. Outside, the evening sky faded into soft shades of orange and purple as another aircraft passed overhead. Its distant engines filled the silence between them. Emma smiled toward the window. "You still look at every airplane." Caleb followed the fading sound until it disappeared beyond the rooftops. His eyes reflected something old, something familiar, like a musician recognizing a forgotten melody after many years. "Some parts of who we are never really leave," he admitted quietly. Then he looked back at his daughter with the same steady smile she trusted more than anything else in the world. Neither of them realized that before another sunrise arrived, the life he had spent years carefully keeping hidden would begin climbing back into the light, one unexpected decision at a time. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale golden sunlight that spilled across the polished windows of Hayes Aerospace headquarters, where every minute carried the weight of multi-million-dollar decisions. Lauren Hayes stood at the far end of a glass conference room overlooking the private runway, one hand resting lightly against the table as executives reviewed charts projected across a towering screen. Behind them, her Gulfstream G700 shimmered in the morning light, like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. "The investors from Seattle will be on board by 11 o'clock, her chief financial officer said. "If everything goes according to schedule, today's agreement will expand our manufacturing division by nearly $2 billion over the next 5 years. Lauren nodded confidently. "Nothing delays this flight." Her assistant quickly confirmed the schedule. Every meeting had been planned down to the minute. Every meal had been prepared. Every route had already been approved through the Federal Aviation Administration. Lauren believed success belonged to those who eliminated uncertainty before it had the opportunity to appear. She built her company the same way she built her reputation, through discipline, relentless preparation, and expecting excellence from everyone around her. As the meeting concluded, she walked toward the observation deck overlooking the private apron. Aircraft moved with graceful precision below while fuel trucks, catering vehicles, and maintenance crews completed their routines with practiced efficiency. Her eyes naturally drifted toward the ground personnel. She recognized several faces from previous departures before noticing Caleb once again inspecting equipment beside the service lane. He moved deliberately, never rushing, never appearing distracted, checking each connection with patient attention that most people overlooked. Lauren folded her arms. "Does that maintenance worker always arrive before everyone else?" she asked. Her operations director glanced outside. "Caleb Dawson?" "Every morning before sunrise. He has not missed a shift in years." "Interesting," Lauren replied, although her tone suggested little real curiosity. Reliable people are valuable, but reliability alone does not put someone in the cockpit of an airplane. The director smiled politely without answering. He had learned long ago that challenging Lauren's first impressions rarely changed them. Moments later, another executive approached carrying a folder. Captain Reynolds confirmed departure at 11:15. Everything is ready. Lauren accepted the folder and continued walking. Good. Experience matters. Credentials matter. Confidence matters. She paused briefly before adding almost to herself, people belong where they have earned the right to stand. Outside, Caleb completed another equipment inspection before helping a new employee secure several cargo containers. The younger worker struggled with one of the locking mechanisms until Caleb quietly demonstrated the proper technique. Never force it, Caleb said with an easy smile. Machines usually tell you what they need if you slow down long enough to listen. The young man laughed. You make everything look simple. Caleb shook his head. Nothing worthwhile is ever simple. It only looks that way after years of practice. Nearby, an older fuel technician watched the exchange with quiet admiration. He had worked at the airport for nearly 3 decades and had seen hundreds of employees come and go. Caleb remained different. He never raised his voice, never sought recognition, and never volunteered stories about himself. Yet every mechanic eventually found themselves asking his advice when something unusual happened. There was a steadiness about him that experience recognized even when titles did not. Above the runway, a light breeze carried the distant sound of another approaching aircraft. Caleb glanced upward for only a second before returning to work. High inside the executive offices, Lauren watched her team finalize another successful morning. Completely unaware that before noon the confidence she placed in titles, resumes, and appearances would be tested by circumstances no amount of planning could control. At 10:23 that morning, the perfect schedule began to unravel one quiet complication at a time. Inside the operations center, computer monitors flickered with updated weather reports while dispatch radios carried an urgency that had been absent only minutes before. Lauren Hayes had just finished greeting 2 members of the Seattle investment team when her director of flight operations hurried toward her with unusual tension written across his face. "We have a situation," he said carefully. Lauren barely slowed her pace. "How serious?" Captain Reynolds became ill on his way to the airport. The medical team advised him not to fly. Lauren stopped walking. "What about First Officer Mitchell?" The director hesitated. His inbound flight from Denver was diverted because of severe thunderstorms. He will not arrive for several hours. For the first time that morning, silence settled over the executive hallway. Assistants exchanged uncertain glances while phones immediately began ringing throughout the operations office. Lauren took a slow breath. "Find another crew. We already started." Within minutes, dispatch contacted charter operators across North Texas. Every qualified pilot was already assigned to scheduled flights or restricted by mandatory crew rest regulations. Another executive entered carrying a tablet. "We have contacted Fort Worth, Love Field, Addison, and Arlington. Nobody is available soon enough." Lauren walked toward the observation windows overlooking the runway. The Gulfstream stood fully fueled, spotless, and ready to depart. Catering had already been loaded. The investors had begun arriving. Every minute of delay increased the possibility of losing the largest agreement her company had pursued in years. She folded her arms, refusing to surrender to frustration. There has to be someone. Down on the ramp, Caleb Dawson continued replacing a hydraulic hose on a baggage tug, while the rest of the maintenance crew noticed the growing tension around the executive terminal. Service vehicles accelerated across the apron. Flight attendants moved more quickly than usual. Radios crackled almost continuously. One mechanic wiped his hands with a shop towel before looking toward the terminal. Something big must be happening. Caleb glanced up briefly before tightening the final fitting. Probably a scheduling problem. The mechanic laughed nervously. "You say that like it is simple." Caleb smiled. "Most problems are simpler after everyone stops panicking." A few hundred feet away, Lauren listened as another disappointing report arrived. "The only available contract pilot cannot be here for at least 2 hours." She checked her watch. "We do not have 2 hours." The investors were already discussing alternate travel plans among themselves. Their expressions remained polite, but Lauren recognized the subtle signs of confidence beginning to disappear. Years of negotiations had taught her that uncertainty often cost more than money. It cost trust. At that very moment, An older airport mechanic named Walter Brennan stepped quietly into the operations office carrying a maintenance clipboard. He had spent nearly 40 years around airplanes and recognized a different kind of tension when he saw it. After listening for only a moment, he cleared his throat. "You keep saying there is nobody here who can fly that airplane." Several executives turned toward him with puzzled expressions. Lauren answered politely but firmly. "That is correct." Walter looked through the glass wall toward the maintenance yard where Caleb had just finished cleaning grease from his hands. A thoughtful smile crossed the older man's face. "I'm not so sure about that." Lauren followed his gaze toward the quiet maintenance worker she had dismissed only hours earlier. Her expression revealed more confusion than curiosity. "The baggage equipment technician?" she asked. Walter nodded slowly without taking his eyes off Caleb. "You might want to ask him a question before you cancel today's flight." The room fell completely still, and for reasons none of them could yet explain, every conversation suddenly seemed to be waiting for the answer. Walter Brennan walked across the maintenance yard with the unhurried confidence of a man who had learned that the truth never needed to run. Caleb had just finished storing his tools when he noticed the older mechanic approaching. "You have visitors," Walter said with a faint smile. Caleb looked toward the executive terminal where Lauren Hayes, her flight operations director, and two company officials were making their way across the ramp. Their polished shoes looked strangely out of place among the service vehicles and painted taxiway lines. "I have a feeling this is not about the baggage tug," Caleb replied quietly. Walter chuckled. "No, it is about an airplane." Lauren stopped a few feet away, maintaining the same composed posture she carried into every boardroom. "Mr. Dawson," she began, "I have been told someone here believes you may have experience beyond ground maintenance." Caleb wiped his hands with a clean shop towel before answering. "I have had a few different jobs over the years." The response was so understated that one executive exchanged a skeptical glance with another. Lauren folded her arms. "We need facts, not modesty. Have you ever flown a business jet?" Caleb hesitated for only a moment. "Yes." "When?" "Several years ago." "For whom?" Caleb met her eyes calmly. "The United States Air Force." The words landed softly, but the effect was immediate. No one laughed. Walter reached into his weathered clipboard and carefully unfolded an old newspaper clipping he had carried for years between maintenance manuals and inspection forms. The paper had yellowed with age, yet the photograph remained clear enough to recognize a younger Caleb standing beside a sleek military aircraft with a flight helmet tucked beneath one arm. Above the image appeared a headline praising an experimental flight program at Edwards Air Force Base. Lauren accepted the clipping with visible surprise. "Why would you keep this?" she asked. Walter smiled. "Because some people deserve to be remembered, even after they choose to disappear." Caleb looked almost embarrassed. "Walter." "No," the older man replied gently. "They should know." He turned toward the executives. "Before he ever worked here, Caleb Dawson was one of the finest experimental pilots I ever heard about. Test aircraft, advanced systems, evaluation flights. He was trusted with machines that most pilots only read about." Lauren studied the photograph again before looking back at the quiet man standing in front of her. The grease on his sleeves, the worn boots, the humble maintenance uniform suddenly seemed to belong to someone she had never truly seen. "If that is true," she asked carefully, "why are you working here?" Caleb's expression softened as he glanced briefly toward the family photograph taped inside his toolbox lid. Emma smiled back from the picture, missing her front tooth and holding a homemade paper airplane. "Because life changes," he answered. "Sometimes the most important promise you ever make is not in the air. It is at home." The operations director interrupted with a tablet in his hands. "I ran his name through the Federal Aviation Administration database after Walter spoke to us." His voice carried equal parts disbelief and admiration. "His airline transport pilot certificate is active. His medical certification is current. He also maintains multiple turbine aircraft type ratings, including the Gulfstream series." Complete silence settled across the ramp. Even the distant sound of idling engines seemed farther away than before. Lauren lowered the newspaper slowly, her earlier confidence replaced by something she had not expected to feel that day. Respect was beginning to replace assumption, and for the first time since meeting Caleb Dawson, she realized she had mistaken quietness for ordinary. Lauren Hayes stood motionless for several seconds, the newspaper clipping still resting in her hands as the afternoon sun reflected across the polished fuselage of the waiting Gulfstream. Around her, the executives who had spent the morning discussing billion-dollar investments now found themselves staring at a maintenance technician with an entirely different kind of respect. Caleb Dawson remained exactly where he had been, calm, patient, and completely unaffected by the sudden change in the room around him. He neither defended his past nor celebrated it. The silence belonged to everyone else. Lauren finally folded the newspaper carefully before handing it back to Walter Brennan. "Why did you never tell anyone?" she asked quietly. Caleb shrugged with the same simplicity that had marked every answer he had given that day. "Because the airport hired me to maintain equipment, not to tell stories." The operations director glanced anxiously toward his watch. "We have 27 minutes before we lose our departure slot." One of the investors approached Lauren with growing concern. "If we miss today's meeting, the board in Seattle will postpone negotiations until next quarter." Lauren nodded without taking her eyes off Caleb. She had spent years believing that confidence meant always having the right answer. Today, the right answer was standing in front of her wearing steel-toe boots. She took one slow step forward. "Mr. Dawson." Caleb looked at her. "Would you be willing to fly my aircraft?" The question seemed to quiet even the distant sounds of the airport. Ground crews slowed their work almost instinctively. A fuel truck rolled past without anyone speaking. Caleb did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the gleaming jet, then toward the passengers waiting near the terminal entrance. Finally, he asked one simple question. "Has the aircraft completed every required inspection?" The chief mechanic answered immediately. "Yes. Weather route. Clear after the first 80 miles. Weight and balance. Already calculated and within limits." Caleb nodded once. Only then did he look back at Lauren. "If every regulation has been followed and every passenger understands that safety comes before schedules, then yes. I will help." Relief spread across several faces at once. Lauren let out a quiet breath she had been holding for far too long. "Thank you." Caleb smiled gently. "You do not need to thank me yet. We still have a flight to complete." He returned to his locker, opened the weathered metal door, and removed a small black flight bag that looked as though it had not been touched in years. Inside rested a neatly organized headset, an electronic flight tablet, and a pair of aviator sunglasses carefully wrapped in a soft cloth. Nothing appeared dusty. Nothing suggested neglect. It looked less like forgotten equipment and more like something patiently waiting for the right day to be needed again. Walter watched with quiet satisfaction. "I wondered if you still kept that ready." Caleb zipped the bag closed. Some promises should stay packed. As he walked beside Lauren toward the aircraft, employees across the ramp paused one after another. The young baggage handler who had asked whether insults ever bothered him watched in silent amazement. Flight attendants exchanged puzzled smiles. Even the security team instinctively stepped aside without being asked. Lauren reached the base of the aircraft stairs before stopping. Only yesterday she had joked that this man belonged polishing the landing gear instead of dreaming about flying her airplane. Now she looked up toward the cockpit, then back at Caleb. Without another word, she stepped aside and extended her hand toward the open cabin door, silently giving him the place of honor. Caleb inclined his head with quiet gratitude before climbing the stairs. Each measured step carried no pride, no resentment. Only the steady confidence of someone returning to a responsibility he had never truly forgotten. And as he disappeared into the cockpit, an unexpected silence settled over the private terminal, because every person watching understood they were witnessing something far greater than a change of pilots. They were watching dignity quietly reclaim its rightful seat. The cockpit welcomed Caleb Dawson with a familiarity that felt untouched by time. Sunlight poured through the wide windshield, illuminating rows of digital flight displays that hummed quietly as electrical systems completed their startup sequence. His hands moved with calm precision, checking switches, reviewing flight management data, confirming navigation routes, and reading each item from memory before verifying it against the electronic checklist. Nothing about his movements appeared rushed. Nothing suggested someone returning after years away. It looked instead like a musician sitting down at a favorite piano, rediscovering a melody that had never truly been forgotten. Lauren Hayes settled into the seat behind the cockpit door reserved for company executives, watching silently through the open entrance as Caleb completed each procedure with quiet confidence. She had expected impressive technical skill. She had not expected such remarkable composure. There was no performance in the way he worked. No desire to impress anyone. Every action served only one purpose: keeping every soul on board safe. The flight attendant stepped inside the cockpit. Cabin secure. Passengers seated. Caleb smiled warmly. "Thank you. Please remind everyone to remain seated until we reach cruising altitude." She nodded before hesitating. "Captain Dawson." Caleb looked up, surprised by the title. The young woman smiled gently. "It feels like the right one." She quietly closed the cockpit door behind her. Moments later, the engines awakened with a smooth, powerful rumble that vibrated softly through the cabin. Outside, the aircraft rolled toward the runway beneath the guidance of ground control. Caleb acknowledged each radio instruction clearly, his voice steady and unhurried, earning immediate respect from the air traffic controllers who had never spoken with him before. As the aircraft lined up on the center line, the runway stretched several thousand feet ahead beneath a cloudless Texas sky. Caleb rested one hand lightly on the thrust levers before speaking almost to himself. "Everything begins with a good decision." He advanced the power smoothly. The engines responded with effortless strength, pressing everyone gently into their seats as the Gulfstream accelerated down the runway. Lauren watched the airspeed indicator climb while the city beyond the windshield slowly transformed into a blur of buildings and sunlight. Then came the familiar, graceful moment when the Earth quietly released its hold. The airplane lifted into the brilliant blue sky with such smoothness that several passengers hardly realized they had already left the ground. Minutes later, as they climbed through scattered clouds, an alert tone sounded softly across one of the cockpit displays. A developing weather cell had shifted farther east than earlier forecasts predicted, placing light turbulence along their planned route. Lauren instinctively looked toward the screen, but Caleb remained perfectly calm. He requested an updated weather advisory from air traffic control, studied the revised radar image for only a few seconds, and requested a minor course adjustment that added less than 5 minutes to the flight while avoiding the rougher air completely. "Approved as requested," the controller replied. Caleb thanked them politely and adjusted the flight path with measured precision. The cabin remained peaceful. Coffee stayed in its cups. Conversations continued uninterrupted. Most passengers never realized that anything had changed at all. Lauren looked through the cockpit windows toward the endless horizon before quietly asking, "Were you ever nervous?" Caleb smiled without taking his eyes from the sky. Every good pilot respects the responsibility. Fear makes people freeze. Respect keeps people prepared. Lauren considered those words as sunlight reflected across the instrument panel. She suddenly understood that the confidence she admired did not come from believing nothing could go wrong. It came from years of choosing calm over pride every single time. Outside, the Gulfstream continued climbing smoothly above a blanket of white clouds, and somewhere far below, the opinions formed on the ground seemed smaller with every passing mile. The remainder of the flight unfolded with the quiet confidence that only true experience could create. Sunlight streamed across the cabin windows as the Gulfstream cruised high above a sea of brilliant white clouds, leaving the tension of the morning far behind. Conversations among the investors gradually shifted from delayed schedules to future partnerships, and the laughter that now filled the cabin sounded entirely different from the laughter Caleb had heard on the ramp only hours earlier. It carried no judgment, only relief. Inside the cockpit, every instrument remained steady while the engines maintained their smooth rhythm. Caleb monitored each system with patient attention, making small adjustments so subtle they were almost invisible. Lauren remained seated just behind him, watching not only how he flew the aircraft, but how he carried himself. There was no trace of arrogance in him, no satisfaction at proving anyone wrong. Even after everything that had happened, he treated every crew member with the same quiet respect. When the flight attendant entered with coffee, Caleb accepted it with a grateful smile before asking whether every passenger was comfortable. "Everyone says this has been the smoothest business flight they can remember," she replied. Caleb nodded gently. "That is always good to hear." Nearly 2 hours later, the skyline of Seattle appeared beyond the windshield, framed by distant mountains and sparkling water beneath the afternoon sun. Air traffic control cleared them for their approach, and Caleb carefully reviewed the landing checklist once more before beginning a gradual descent. The aircraft floated through scattered clouds with remarkable grace, each movement measured and unhurried. Lauren glanced outside as the runway slowly came into view. "You make it look effortless," she said quietly. Caleb smiled. "The goal is never to impress people. The goal is to let them forget they ever had a reason to worry." Those words remained with Lauren as the landing gear extended with its familiar mechanical sound. A few moments later, the wheels touched the runway so gently that several passengers continued reading documents without looking up. The aircraft slowed smoothly before exiting onto the taxiway, where ground crews waited to guide them toward the executive terminal. As the engines settled into idle power, a calm silence filled the cockpit. No applause came from the cabin. None was needed. Everyone simply understood they had experienced something extraordinary. After the parking brake was set and the final shutdown checklist completed, Caleb removed his headset with the same quiet composure he had carried throughout the day. He reached for his worn flight bag, intending to leave as quietly as he had arrived. Before he could stand, Lauren stepped into the cockpit doorway holding a dark navy captain's cap embroidered with the Hayes Aerospace flight insignia. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she placed the cap carefully on the instrument panel in front of him. "This belonged to Captain Reynolds," she said softly. "Today, I think it belongs here." Caleb looked at the cap before gently shaking his head. "It belongs to the captain assigned to your aircraft." Lauren smiled, though her eyes reflected something far deeper than confidence. "No," she answered. "It belongs to the person who earned everyone's trust before asking for anyone's respect." The cockpit became completely still. The flight attendant quietly lowered her eyes. The operations manager standing outside the door removed his own headset without speaking. Even the investors waiting in the aisle instinctively paused, sensing that they had stepped into a moment that money could never purchase. Lauren finally looked directly at Caleb. "This morning I saw a maintenance uniform and believed I understood the man wearing it. I was wrong." Caleb answered with the same gentle smile that had carried him through every misunderstanding. "We all miss things when we only look at the surface." Lauren nodded slowly. "Thank you for reminding me to look deeper." Outside the cockpit windows, the afternoon sunlight reflected across the wings as if the sky itself had quietly witnessed the moment when respect finally caught up with truth. 3 days after the flight, life at Dallas Executive Airport appeared to have returned to its familiar rhythm. The morning sun painted long golden lines across the runway while baggage carts rolled quietly between waiting aircraft and mechanics greeted one another with steaming cups of coffee. Caleb Dawson arrived before sunrise as he always had, wearing the same maintenance uniform, carrying the same weathered lunch cooler, and parking in the same corner of the employee lot. Nothing about him suggested that he had recently guided a corporate jet across the country or quietly saved one of the largest business agreements in Hayes Aerospace history. That was exactly how he preferred it. As he finished inspecting a service vehicle, a sleek black sedan entered the maintenance area instead of stopping at the executive terminal. Lauren Hayes stepped out carrying a slim leather portfolio, but this time there were no cameras, no executives, and no audience. She walked toward Caleb with the calm humility of someone who had spent several days thinking more about character than success. "Good morning," she said. Caleb smiled warmly. "Good morning. Did the meeting go well?" Lauren nodded. "Better than I imagined. The agreement was signed before lunch." Caleb extended his hand. "Congratulations." She accepted the handshake, but did not immediately let go. "I came because I owe someone a proper thank you." Caleb gently shook his head. "You already thanked me." Lauren smiled softly. "Not the person I needed to thank most." She glanced toward the small parking area where Emma had just climbed out of the pickup truck carrying her sketchbook before school. The little girl waved cheerfully, unaware of the significance of the visitor standing nearby. Lauren knelt to meet her at eye level. "You must be Emma." She nodded proudly. "Yes, ma'am." Lauren reached into the leather portfolio and carefully removed a beautifully framed photograph taken just after the aircraft had landed in Seattle. It showed Caleb sitting quietly in the cockpit, sunlight pouring through the windshield while one hand rested gently on the controls. Beneath the photograph was a small engraved plaque that read, "Quiet strength guides far beyond the sky." Emma stared at the picture with shining eyes. "That is my daddy." "Yes," Lauren answered. And he reminded an entire company what real leadership looks like. Caleb looked down modestly. It was just one flight. Lauren stood and smiled. No, it was one lesson. She then handed Caleb another envelope. Inside was an offer to become Hayes Aerospace Director of Advanced Flight Training, leading the development of young pilots and mentoring future captains. The salary was generous, the benefits extraordinary, and the position carried enormous prestige. Caleb read every page carefully before closing the folder. I cannot accept the title simply because I happened to be in the right place that day. Lauren looked disappointed for only a moment before Caleb continued. But I would be honored to teach if the purpose is helping others become better pilots and better people. A smile spread across Lauren's face. That was exactly the purpose. Later that evening, after Emma had finished her homework, father and daughter sat together on a grassy hill overlooking the airport fence as airplanes lifted one by one into the glowing Texas sunset. Emma leaned her head against Caleb's shoulder. Daddy, yes. Are you a hero? Caleb watched another jet climb slowly into the orange sky before answering. No, sweetheart. Heroes are people who choose to do the right thing even when nobody is watching. I am still trying to become one. Emma slipped her small hand into his and smiled. I think you are doing a really good job. Caleb smiled back without saying another word. High above them, another airplane disappeared into the evening light, leaving only a quiet white trail across the endless blue. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a woman who once judged a man by his uniform would forever remember that the strongest people rarely ask to be seen because dignity, like the finest pilots, always lets its actions speak before its name.